I just wanted to share with you a quick story. Make you up your own mind on this one, but I I came across this morning and just was dumbfounded by it. Now, I wouldn't say I'm a baseball fan to the degree where I can sit around and say, well, back in 1940 when Ernie Lombardi hit 310, uh, that was clearly the reason that the Baseball Hall of Fame finally woke up and admitted him in 1979. And you'll hear these people talk about batting averages. I was watching a television show a few weeks ago, and we were talking about George Will in the last hour. And in the television show, George Will gets into a discussion. He's just talking about the Cleveland Spiders, which was a baseball team back in the 1800s. And he's using the Cleveland Spiders as his prime example of what he's trying to point out, like an analogy. And everyone else is just sitting there thinking, okay. But he knows what he's talking about when it comes to baseball. Maybe not so much politics anymore, but he certainly knows about baseball. 925, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. I am what I would describe as a much more casual fan. I have my team, and I like to watch them on TV just about every day. But when it comes to somebody else's team, it's kind of, I might know your starting pitcher, but beyond that, or your starting pitching rotation, not a whole lot. I bring this up, though, because I am a fan of Curt Schilling, and I've been a fan of Curt Schilling going all the way back to when he pitched in Arizona. Any team that can beat the New York Yankees, and they did it in a World Series, ooh, I was happy. I was very happy. And then he moved over to the Boston Red Sox, where he won another World Series, and he did it in the most courageous manner while wearing a bloody sock after they had to suture, I think it was his Achilles tendon to the back of his heel on one foot, on his plant foot. And he ended up going the distance in a game, or nearly the distance, giving his team a victory. And they came back after being down 3-0 in a playoff series, and came back and won 4 straight games and won. That had never happened in baseball before. Schilling went on to a great career, at least for a while, as a broadcaster, until ESPN fired him a couple of weeks ago because he's not supportive of this notion that men who think they are women should be allowed in women's restrooms. And he's been public about that. Well, all right, it's ESPN's right to fire anyone. That's from a libertarian perspective, I'm not a believer that, you are owed a job. In fact, nowhere in the Constitution does it say you have a right to one. ESPN, though, I saw it, in fact, last summer. I was watching it on Netflix one day. ESPN has an old film called 4 Days in October, which is about the Red Sox turning that series around and defeating the Yankees. And one of the cornerstones of that show is that game where Curt Schilling was out there with a bloody sock trying to pitch his team to victory, despite the pain and perhaps, being the end of his career because of the pressure he put on that foot. ESPN has now gone and edited that show, that documentary. ESPN left that game. So now I guess it's not 4 days in October. It must be 3 days in October. They have edited that portion out. There is no mention of Curt Schilling. He has vanished. He has disappeared. Curt Schilling and maybe David Ortiz were the two cornerstones of that World Series title, that World Series team for the Boston Red Sox. And now there's no mention of Curt Schilling whatsoever in the documentary. In the old Soviet Union, they used to airbrush people out of pictures when they fell out of favor with the government, or they would tear down statues of old revolutionary heroes if Stalin didn't like them. And in fact, in some early documentaries or early movies from the Soviet era, Stalin literally had himself brushed into those movies, so he would seem like he was at the right hand of Lenin. Well, here's ESPN. All right, you fired the guy. Okay, understood. You favor the idea of grown men using toilets with 3-year-old girls. All right, fine. But to airbrush him out of a documentary where he played perhaps the pivotal role in that film? What the heck is wrong with these people? Speaking of that, talking about the transgenders, I've got to jump around here a little bit because I'm coming up on a break. Target stock has dropped. If you recall, Target said it would allow 35-year-old men who haven't shaved in 3 days to go in and use the little girl's room. The Family Policy Institute of Washington reported that the company's stock fell from $84.10 per share on April 19 to roughly $79.36 on Friday. That's $79.36, explaining that a loss of $4.74 per share quote, would represent a corporate loss of over $2.5 billion, unquote, if constant. This after Target's announcement. This has happened. I found this in the Christian Post. There's a lot more to all of this. There's a fellow writing today. I found this. Kel Thomas shared this on his Facebook page. A fellow writing in something called thepublicdiscourse.com saying that this whole transgender thing, this is a doctor who actually pioneered sex change surgery at Johns Hopkins University 40 years ago. And the doctor says this is all a bunch of bunk. And he said, unfortunately, though, some states make it impossible they will jail a doctor who tries to counsel someone and say, no, you're really not a woman, even though you claim you feel that way. They will jail, 2 states will jail a doctor who does that. I want to talk about that a little bit in the next segment of the program. Bill Colley with you on Top Story this morning on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. It's just, we're enshrining insanity, and the government's now standing up for the insane and jailing the sane. What's wrong with that picture? I've been telling you that we'll eventually break out and have some spring-like weather, maybe even some summer-like weather. It looks like we're finally there. Weather forecast this week, lots of temperatures bouncing into the high 70s, perhaps lower 80s. A little rain this weekend, but still, it's not going to cool us off considerably. So the summer heat is right around the corner, and whether you need repairs right away or just would like to avoid problems in the future, you need to call the professionals at Ramsey Heating and Electric. Make sure the job is done right the first time and set yourself up for a great summer. You can see them at 2600 Overland Avenue in Burley or give them a telephone call, 678-0459. That's 678-0459, Ramsey Heating and Electric. They sell warm winters and cool summers. Ramsey Heating and Electric. 9:34, Bill Colley with you this morning on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. So, we've got all of these people arguing and saying, it's mean-spirited if you do not let some 40-year-old dude go into the bathroom and undress apparently in front of all of the ladies. This is not a battle going away anytime soon. I mentioned this earlier. This is from a publication called thepublicdiscourse.com. Paul McHugh. For 40 years at the University Distinguished Service Professor of Psychiatry at Johns Hopkins Medical School, 26 of which were also spent as psychiatrist-in-chief at Johns Hopkins Hospital, I've been studying people who claim to be transgender. Over that time, I've watched the phenomenon change and expand in remarkable ways. A rare issue of a few men, but both homosexual and heterosexual, including some who sought sex change surgery, because they were erotically aroused by the thought or image of themselves as women, has spread to include women as well as men. Even young boys and girls have begun to present themselves as of the opposite sex. Over the last 10 or 15 years, this has increased in prevalence, seemingly exponentially. Now almost everyone has heard of or met such a person. I'm not going to give you the entire, it's long. As I said, I found this shared by Kel Thomas this morning on Facebook. He writes, at Johns Hopkins, after pioneering sex change surgery, we demonstrated that the practice brought no important benefits. As a result, we stopped offering that form of treatment nearly 40 years ago. Our efforts, though, had a little influence on the emergence of this new idea about sex or upon the expansion of the number of transgendered. I have not met or examined Bruce Jenner, but this behavior or his behavior resembles that of some of the transgender males we have studied over the years. These men wanted to display themselves in sexy ways, wearing provocative female garb. More often than not, while claiming to be a woman in a man's body, they declared themselves to be lesbians, that is, while still men, dressed as women, were attracted to other women. So they still had that part of their maleness. The photograph of the posed, corseted, breast-boosted Bruce Jenner, a man in his mid-60s but flaunting himself as a pinup girl in her 20s or 30s, on the cover of Vanity Fair suggests that he may fit the behavioral mode that Roy Blanchard has dubbed an expression of autogenophilia. That means attracted to women and auto in the form of oneself. The meme that your sex is a feeling, not a biological fact, and can change at any time marches on through our society. In a way, it's reminiscent of the Hans Christian Andersen tale, The Emperor's New Clothes. In that tale, the emperor, believing that he wore an outfit of special beauty imperceptible to the rude or uncultured, paraded naked through his town to the huzzas of courtiers and citizens, anxious about their reputations. And the writer says, many onlookers to the contemporary transgender parade, knowing that a disfavored opinion is worse than bad taste today, they fear to identify it as a misapprehension. And again, as I say, I'm jumping around here. I'm not giving you the entire publication. It's, my gosh, he's got about 4 pages of this. Both state and federal governments are actively, he writes, seeking to block any treatments that can be construed as challenging the assumptions and choices of transgendered youngsters. Quote, as part of our dedication to protecting America's youth, this administration supports efforts to ban the use of conversion therapy for minors, unquote, said Valerie Jarrett, senior advisor to President Obama. In 2 states, a doctor who would look into the psychological history of a transgendered boy or girl in search of a resolvable conflict could lose his or her license to practice medicine. By contrast, such a physician would not be penalized if he or she started such a patient on hormones that would block puberty and might stunt growth. Folks, this is wacky. What is needed now is a public clamor for coherent science, biological and therapeutic science, examining the real effects of these efforts to support transgendering. Although much is made of a rare intersex individual, no evidence supports the claim that people such as Jenner have a biological source for their transgender assumptions. Plenty of evidence demonstrates that with him and most others, transgendering is a psychological rather than a biological matter. But gird your loins if you would confront this matter. Hell hath no fury, he writes, like a vested interest masquerading as a moral principle. That is from Paul McHugh, Dr. Paul McHugh, a university distinguished professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins Medical School and the former psychiatrist-in-chief at Johns Hopkins Hospital. He is the author of The Mind Has Mountains, Reflections on Society and Psychiatry. In other words, these people are bats. And we've got to start addressing it like we used to. They're nuts. They're crazy. They're loony. They need our help. They don't need our understanding. 20 minutes away from 10 o'clock. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310. KLIX and NewsRadio1310.com.